Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a worldview held by billions of people, but one that's also, well, pretty misunderstood. We're talking about the intellectual case for atheism.
So, when you really get down to it, what is the intellectual framework behind atheism? It's so much more than just saying, I don't believe. There's a whole structure of philosophical, logical, and evidence-based arguments that it's built on. And that's exactly what we're going to explore today.
All right, first up, the evidence standard. You could call this the rules of the game because pretty much everything else we'll talk about hinges on this one core principle, the demand for credible evidence.
So, right at the heart of this whole thing is something called the burden of proof. And it's actually a really simple idea. It basically says that it's not your job to disprove something someone says. It's their job, the person making the claim, to back it up with evidence. So if someone says a God exists, the ball is in their court to prove it.
You know, the best way to get your head around this is with Bertrand Russell's famous celestial teapot analogy. It's brilliant. Imagine I told you there's a tiny china teapot orbiting the sun, somewhere out past Mars. You can't prove me wrong, right? You can't scan all of space. But that doesn't mean you should believe me. The burden is on me to show you the evidence, to hand you the telescope and point. Without that proof, there's just no good reason to believe in the teapot, or for that matter, any other claim that can't be tested.
Okay, and this right here is a super important point. The stance we're talking about isn't, I know for a fact that no gods exist. I mean, how could you prove that? Proving a negative is practically impossible. No, the actual stance is much more subtle. It's about withholding belief because there isn't enough evidence. Think of it as a position of skepticism, not a counterclaim.
So, what this all leads to is a shift in the question itself. It's not about asking, can you prove it's false? The real question becomes, can this claim even be tested? This is a huge concept in science called falsifiability. For an idea to be taken seriously, there has to be some conceivable way to prove it wrong. And the argument here is that a lot of theistic claims are set up in a way that makes them completely untestable, which, from this perspective, puts them outside the realm of rational discussion.
Okay, so that's the standard. Now, how does it hold up when we apply it to reality? Let's look at one of the biggest, oldest questions out there, the problem of suffering.
And here's where the rubber really meets the road. On one hand, you have the claim there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good God. Okay, but then you look at the world, at observed reality, and you see something else, profound, heartbreaking suffering, often happening to the most innocent among us. The argument simply asks, how can both of these things be true at the same time?
And we're not just talking about abstract philosophical suffering here. The argument points to very real, gut-wrenching examples. Childhood cancer, entire communities wiped out by natural disasters, things that seem completely pointless. This is what's called gratuitous suffering, suffering that appears to have no redemptive quality, no greater purpose. It just happens.
This whole issue has a name, the evidential problem of evil. Now, of course, there are theological explanations for this, called theodicies, that try to fit suffering into a divine plan. But from the perspective we're examining, the logic is pretty direct. Wouldn't a perfect, all-good being prevent any suffering that didn't serve some clear, greater purpose? The very fact that this seemingly pointless suffering exists is, in itself, presented as powerful evidence against the existence of that kind of being.
All right, let's switch gears. The next line of argument isn't about what we do see, but what we don't. It's the argument from absence, and it asks a really simple question. Why the hide and seek? This is known as the argument from divine hiddenness, and it really is a puzzle. You know, think about it. If there's a God who wants a personal relationship with every single one of us and has the power to make itself known, then why do so many sincere, open-minded people search and find nothing? It's a disconnect that the argument really hones it on.
And this idea gets some pretty strong backing when you look at the data. I mean, look at this. One of the strongest predictors of what you believe is simply where you were born. If you're born in one region, you're overwhelmingly likely to believe in God X, in another, God Y. The argument is that this pattern looks a lot more like a cultural, human phenomenon, something passed down through families and societies, than a universal truth revealed to everyone equally.
Okay, so we've looked at external evidence. Now the argument turns inward, to look at the very concept of God itself. The question becomes, is it even logically coherent?
And this is where we get into some of those classic mind-bending paradoxes. You've probably heard this one. Can an all-powerful being create a stone so heavy that it can't lift it? I mean, think about it. If it can't create the stone, then it's not all-powerful because it can't lift it. If it can't create the stone, then it's not all-powerful because it can't create it. It's a real brain teaser. And these kinds of paradoxes are used to question whether all those divine attributes, omnipotence, perfect goodness, being unchanging, can actually exist together without contradicting each other.
So, the point here is pretty fundamental. The argument suggests that if the very definition of God is riddled with internal contradictions, then the concept itself might be logically impossible from the get-go, before you even start looking for evidence in the outside world.
So, okay, if the case against theism rests on things like lack of evidence and logical problems, what's the alternative? What's the other framework for making sense of everything?
Well, that alternative is called naturalism, and it's basically the idea that the universe operates according to natural laws and forces. That's it. It's the view that we can understand reality using the tools of science and reason without needing to bring anything supernatural into the picture.
And you know, one of the most compelling arguments for this comes from just looking at human history. For thousands of years, what was lightning? The wrath of a god. What caused disease? Divine punishment. But now, we have meteorology, we have germ theory. The story of science has been one of consistently explaining things that used to be mysteries attributed to the supernatural. This is sometimes called the God of the Gaps argument. As science fills in the gaps in our knowledge, the space for supernatural explanations just keeps on shrinking.
And this isn't just about science. It has huge implications for how we live. This framework really champions things like critical thinking, questioning what you're told, and being willing to change your mind based on new evidence. And maybe most importantly, it puts the responsibility for making the world a better, more ethical place right on our shoulders. It's on us.
So, when you boil it all down, the argument is that naturalism is just a more parsimonious explanation of reality. That's a fancy way of saying it's the simplest explanation that accounts for all the evidence. You know, Occam's razor. It uses the same tools that have proven so reliable in every other area of our lives, like science and logic, without having to add this extra unproven supernatural layer on top.
And that really brings us full circle, right back to where we started. The entire case we've just walked through isn't really about faith versus denial. It's trying to reframe the whole conversation around one thing: evidence. And so, it leaves us with a final, pretty powerful question to think about. Is the most rational stance, after all this, to simply wait for compelling evidence?